President Trump officially making it happen, announcing his reelection campaign in front of a raucous full house at Amboy Arena in Orlando, Florida. This happened last night. Was worth staying up for some of us, just to see the crowd reaction. And while media undersells it, no Democrat in this field, there's 20 some Democrats running, none of them can pull that kind of crowd and that kind of reaction. It's like looking at the other 16 Republicans that he faced back in 2016. And so many of them, I mentioned in the program, I think in the first hour, a comment from a listener who mentioned his son has decided to settle in Montana and doesn't even want to come home to Twin Falls. Montana it's trending more red again. It went purplish for a while, which is why you have a governor there, a Democrat named Steve Bullock. He is one of those announced 23, is it 23 or 24? It says, Bill, it's 248. Okay, we got it. He's one of the large gaggle of Democrats who've announced that he's running for president. He made an announcement. There was a big cover piece about him in the Washington Post, telling everyone how wonderful he is, and he'd be able to work across the aisle, and wouldn't it be wonderful to have a president nobody knows? Because truly nobody knows him. If you look at all the polling data, his name doesn't even show up. So he announced a campaign, and then he went down to some bar in Helena and got, all liquored up, and that was the end of it. He didn't even have any money to travel with. So much for that. He is representative of most of the candidates running on the Democrat side. Eric Swalwell decides to go have he stood outside the NRA offices in the nation's capital talking about gun confiscation. Remember, this is the guy who said that we have nukes. If you think you're going to stand up to us with your guns, we have nukes. Yeah, there's a guy. They keep saying Donald Trump shouldn't have his finger on the button. Here's a guy saying, I'm going to nuke you if you think you're going to keep your Second Amendment. He showed up yesterday. There were like 10 people there. Most of them were his unemployed brothers-in-law. They showed up and they stood on the street with him. And that was it. The NRA mocked it in a tweet showing this tiny crowd standing outside. You know what I would have done? I would have ordered pizza and had it sent to them. Yeah, that homeless gang out there looks like they might be hungry. We did that a few years ago. I was working at a talk radio station, a few years ago. As you get older, 15 years ago. And a co-host and I decided that what we would do is we would sing Christmas carols outside the offices of the local ACLU. We invited people to join us. And then while we were there, we ordered pizza. Then we sent it inside. They didn't like us being there. 10 minutes now after 8 o'clock. It is 60. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And I thank you very much for joining us today. The president was trying to explain to his voters, his supporters in Orlando, that if the other side wins, he's trying to explain what the worst case scenario would be.
Imagine if we had a Democrat president and a Democrat Congress in 2020. They would shut down your free speech, use the power of the law to punish their opponents, which they're trying to do now anyway. They'll always be trying to shield themselves. They would strip Americans of their constitutional rights while flooding the country with illegal immigrants in the hopes it will expand their political base and they'll get votes someplace down the future. That's what it's about.
So the president had nearly 22,000 people in that arena. The capacity for a concert is 22,000. He said he had 120,000 ticket requests. I don't doubt that figure. Florida's a crowded place, and there'd be a lot of people who'd want to come out and see the President of the United States. And in Florida, I have some old friends from high school that live down there, and you talk about staunch Trump supporters. Florida is divided between a lot of older retirees who come from a particular part of the country where they have a lot of liberals, but it's also a lot of people who are still of working age there are hardworking people. And they've just decided they're going to settle there because the weather is nice year-round. Doesn't mean, though, that they're looking for free stuff all the time. So you've got 120,000 ticket requests for the president's kickoff speech. Bernie Sanders went to YouTube. He didn't have any audience, to my knowledge, other than a few hundred Democrat socialists who were watching. But Bernie tried to, this is about as witty as he gets.
I just had the extremely unpleasant experience of actually watching Donald Trump in action for an hour and a half. Wow. And that was certainly something.
Yes, that was something. Ha, 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 ha. Why did the Democrat socialist cross the road? So he could get free health care. Ha, 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 ha. 8:12 now on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Sanders is being pushed away not only by the people who lead the Democrat Party. They didn't want him in 2016. They don't want him now. They fear that they won't get the big Wall Street money pouring into their coffers and that that's going to hurt them in a general election. What they've done to help out is they've recruited the mainstream media to puff up some other candidates instead. From Warren Henry, writing at The Federalist, he said, "You already may have noticed the establishment media is trying really hard to make Elizabeth Warren happen. Her presidential campaign is being hailed not just as ideas first, but non-stop ideas." There was a funny piece I read last week. She comes out and makes these speeches and says, "This is my plan, and this is what I'm going to do. First of all, before we get started, let's all join in and chant with me." And then they all sit down in their seats, and she gives them an idea, but most of the ideas that she's proposing, there was a writer who pointed out, have already been proposed by her colleagues in the U.S. Senate. So there's nothing new. The writer goes on to say, the new push has helped lift Warren above Sanders in one national poll and in a Monmouth poll of Nevada. Overall, however, she still lags Sanders nationwide. Tellingly, her favorable ratings are weak in her home state of Massachusetts. There's a line that came out of a talk show host, a sports talk show host in Chicago many, many years ago, and he was reflecting on how national media will say one thing, and he said these people are what you'd call not locally smart. I'm paraphrasing him in that. You'll see this happen where someone will say, well, you know, they got a great governor in such and such a state. But then you find out the people who live there, they despise their governor. And that if that governor were to run for re-election in that state, the governor would lose. And they try to promote them, I guess, as a matter of getting them out of that state, then onto a national stage before everyone else figures out they're incompetent. The writer goes on to say, in fact, this is the quote, a Chicago sports radio host once coined a term to describe situations where the national media was out of step with the locals. He called it out-of-town stupid. When this sort of divergence happens, it's worth asking why. In this case, it may be that the establishment media is unhappy not only with a relatively moderate Biden as the front-runner, but also with Sanders as his chief rival. This would, at the very least, explain the framing of Warren's recent gains as Sanders' loss, highlighting that poll respondents would be more disappointed if Biden or Sanders became the nominee. There is any number of reasons why the establishment media would prefer Warren to Sanders as the chief rival to Biden. Like Biden, Sanders is an old, straight, male, white dude. Worse still, he does not indulge in left-wing identity politics. Sanders also lacks appeal to non-white voters as much as Biden does. Are they saying that she's 70? Are they saying that somehow that's going to be better? And she's going to be better with minorities? How is she going to be better with minorities? I would think that some of the things she's already said about being a minority that weren't true probably could hurt her chances in the long run, wouldn't you? And again, I keep getting back to this. The media says that Donald Trump is a liar. And then Bernie Sanders says, college is going to be free. Healthcare is going to be free. Those are lies. Those are blatant lies. There's nothing going to be free. You're going to pay through the nose in taxes for that. Well, she claimed that she was Cherokee. For crying out loud, folks, she's as white as a sheet. I mean, she's so white you could almost see through her. Well, most people do, I would think. Coming up on 8:16 on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. If you weren't with us earlier, I'm repeating a lot today because I think some of these comments need to be made, and I know the audience changes during the course of the show. You can't always be listening to all 4 hours. Some people sleep late. Some people have to get in and out of a car, and they can't necessarily hear what's going on while they're doing that. Sanders said during an interview last week, and this is where he contradicted himself. He was asked about having to pay. I think it was Jonathan Carl at ABC asked him about what this is all going to cost. And Sanders says, well, the American people would be delighted to pay more taxes as long as they know they can get free health care and free college. But again, you just said they're going to be paying more in taxes. They're going to be paying a lot more in taxes in order to get it for free. How is it that if you're paying, you're getting it free? Again, it's a big lie, but media will not call it out as a big lie. Instead, they say, well, Donald Trump tells little white lies and big lies all the time. Well, yeah, but he's getting things done. And a lot of what he does, he knows it's bluster. His supporters know it's bluster, and it's that bluster that helps get those things done. It makes the Mexicans come to the bargaining table and say, okay, we'll do something about the border. You got to be able to look at the mainstream media and realize just how the groupthink rules everything, and they are of the opinion that everybody loves them and everybody is still listening to them, and that everyone goes, I didn't think of it that way. I'm glad you told me how to vote, Mr. Acosta. Trump, by the way, is being criticized for putting out same old bromides during his speech last night. However, think about this for a moment. Does the crowd seem to mind?
Together, we will make America wealthy again. We will make America strong again. We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again.
Where is it that in American political history you have been able to see it's going back 4 years now, when Trump first announced in 2015, it wasn't long after that he went to Mobile, Alabama. I have a friend who lives there, and she was at the rally. He filled a football stadium with 40,000 people, a college football stadium. And folks said, well, crowds don't mean anything, and it'll wear off. He's still drawing in these mammoth crowds. Where is it that someone has had that effect in American politics, where they draw crowds like rock stars or country music stars, and these crowds are vocal and noisy? And when Trump does say many of the same things he's always said, the crowd gets up on cue and starts chanting responses. It's cathartic. It's almost like being at a Roman Catholic Mass where the priest says something and then there's a prayer response. It's the same thing every time you go to Mass, but people still keep going and they're still dedicated to it. Well, I'm making that as an analogy or a metaphor here, but what Trump is doing is he's reinforcing what these people believe, and that's why they believe in him. 20 minutes after 8 o'clock, it's 60. Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Thank you for joining me this morning, and we've got a lot more coming up on the program, and since we've devoted so much to the president today and his remarks from last night, we're going to expand into some other issues. There are some people out there who are now saying that we need more euthanasia, that is killing of people, so that we can harvest their organs, and better yet, we should be harvesting their organs while they're still alive. This is happening in a country next door to us. Details on the way. I shared a piece from the Washington Examiner this morning where the writer was critical of Donald Trump because Trump had lost Orange County, California, and was the first Republican presidential candidate to lose it in decades. But you have to look deeper into this and realize it had been trending more and more blue for those decades as well. Trying to blame that on Donald Trump seems to me to be a bit of a stretch. Yet the guy has a history that wrote this. Even though he's a conservative, he's got a history as an ever-Trumper. Well, there are still people within the conservative movement who are very supportive of Donald Trump. One of them is F.H. Buckley, and he teaches at Scalia Law School. He's the author of a book called The Republican Workers' Party, How the Trump Victory Drove Everyone Crazy and Why It Was Just What We Needed. He has a column today, an opinion piece, a guest commentary at the Wall Street Journal. Coming up on 8:23, it is 60. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. And he's warning us, he says in the subheadline, as lawful assisted suicide spreads, Some advocates call for a monstrous expansion. We have mentioned this on the air. Liberals always say, there's no slippery slope here. It's like when they told us, we just want civil unions. Yeah, we're not going to be asking for marriage. How'd that work out? And they told us when we brought up slippery slope arguments, you're just, trying to scare people. When we talk about abortion, we've said, eventually they're going to be killing babies right up until the time of birth. You're just trying to scare people. Then we said they'll likely then move on to killing old people off because, old people take up a lot of resources and they're no longer working, and younger people, you're just trying to scare people, they'd say. Or we would tell you they'll do it like they do in China, where when some old wheezing member of the Politburo needs an organ, they just go down to the prison, they condemn some prisoner, chop him open, take out the organ, so they can plant it in the old wheezing 92-year-old communist. You're just trying to scare people. All right, this is from F.H. Buckley, writing in the Wall Street Journal. Euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide is legal, he writes, in Switzerland, Holland, and Belgium, as well as a growing number of U.S. states, including California, Colorado, and most recently Maine, whose governor signed the Death with Dignity Act last week. New medical guidance in Canada, where the practice has been legal for 3 years for terminally ill patients, hints at the monstrous ways assisted suicide might be expanded in the coming years. About 30 euthanasia patients in Canada have donated their organs after death since 2016. On June 3rd, the Canadian Medical Association issued guidelines for how the process should work. The grim document describes how the organ donation and euthanasia decisions might be disentangled, but allows doctors to raise the possibility of organ donation with assisted suicide patients. It also clarifies that organ removal should not begin until the patient is medically deceased and the heart has stopped beating. But some experts quarrel with this restriction. Last year, in a New England Journal of Medicine article, 2 Canadian medical researchers and a Harvard bioethicist argued that it could reduce the quality of donated organs. A superior model, they suggest, could be to kill the patient by removing his organs, and then after all, the best organs come from live people like those who donate one of their kidneys. Organs, they write, could be compromised if doctors have to wait until death. The writer says this is more than a little ghoulish. Do you understand the type of people that we're now dealing with? And that's happening just across our northern border. You've got people saying, chop them open and take their organs first, and then let them die. Then give them whatever you're going to give them to knock them off. 826, Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. We've got a caller joining us. Caller, you're on the air.
Good morning, Bill. Let's see if I can keep my thoughts straight here. First of all, we don't have to worry about Russian interference because the Russians and all communist countries, they have the power of the gun at the voting booth, so everybody votes for the incumbent. And our biggest threat there will be that how are the Democrats going to falsify so many votes to win the next election. And item number 2, talking about euthanasia, which I don't know why we're concerned about youth in Asia, but Planned Parenthood is already doing the organ harvesting. They've been caught. Remember? And
then the fellow who got the videos has now been fined by a judge in court because he told the American people the truth about what was going on. You know what that's comparable to? If you had lived next door to a Nazi death camp and you had discovered what was going on, wouldn't it be within moral grounds to tell the other neighbors what was taking place there?
Yeah, you might get shot for doing it, but you're absolutely right. Yep. So I just want to confirm, again, I don't know why we're concerned about euthanasia, but we'll go from there. I'm going to turn it back to you. You are great. Okay,
hey,
thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the call. And checks in the mail. Praise will get you, flattery will get you everywhere. David DeLeiden was the name of the fellow who took those Planned Parenthood videos where all of these women were sitting there and they were, sitting around in restaurants and just chowing down their lunch and bragging about how they were selling the body parts and making all sorts of money. And it's funny sometimes when they're screaming when you bring them out of the womb, it's almost like they're alive. So we just snip and cut their spinal cords. The screaming stops right away. They don't feel a thing, by the way. Yeah. Let me show you. Let me get out an axe here and I'm going to hit you right in the neck with it. Well, DeLeiden just put out an email, just showed up in my email account just a few minutes ago, my private email account. He says, "Dear pro-life friend, Planned Parenthood is trying to destroy me. Through a 30-month undercover video investigation, I exposed damning evidence of Planned Parenthood's illegal trafficking of aborted baby body parts. I caught, he writes, Planned Parenthood's leaders heartlessly negotiating the sale of tiny baby hearts, lungs, and brains while they casually ate lunch. I lifted the veil on Planned Parenthood's disgusting practices and revealed the bloody reality it had tried to bury under a facade of slick marketing. And now that Planned Parenthood is just one vote away from being stripped of $500 million in taxpayer subsidies, delivering a devastating blow to this corrupt and evil abortion business, Planned Parenthood, he writes, wants revenge. In fact, the powerful state attorney general of California, Xavier Becerra, is doing Planned Parenthood's bidding and prosecuting a bogus 15 felony case against me for exposing Planned Parenthood's corruption. They want me to shut up, and they'll stop at nothing to accomplish their goal. He says, but I promise you I will not be silenced. If you've got liberals and they're animal rights activists, they think that they should be able to come onto your farm or your ranch and videotape how your livestock is being treated. Their goal is to call you out and claim that you are morally inferior to them, and then they want to shut down your farming or ranching operation. If you expose fellow travelers, though, for killing small children, for infanticide, they see that as an entirely different matter, and they want you shut up for exposing them. They're more interested in what happens to some bovine or some chicken than they are a little baby. And they call themselves superior human beings. It's 8:30. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 62. Got more coming up on this program. I mentioned the tearing down of statues earlier. I've got the actual story in front of me. If you want to stick around, I'll talk a bit more about that coming up in a few minutes. It's happening in neighboring Oregon. That's a virus that is spreading likely eventually to our own state, and we've got to be forever vigilant. We're all familiar with what's going on in the neighboring states off to our west. It's nothing to do with the people who live in eastern Oregon or Washington State or in the valleys of California. It's the fact that their lives are now dominated by the tyranny of the liberals in the coastal cities. And due to that, it has radically changed the cultures of those entire states to the point where there is going to be, I think, a tremendous clash. At some point, the folks in the eastern sides are going to say enough. And how are you going to stop them? And maybe even the liberals will go along with that and just live in their tiny city-state enclaves piled high with human excrement. Very good possibility of that. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I mentioned a story earlier in the program, and I did not have the clipping directly in front of me, so I wanted to touch on this now. From Breitbart, University of Oregon students call for removal of oppressive pioneer statue. How would a statue be oppressive? If it, falls on you, I guess it would be oppressive. Yeah, that might sting a bit. And depending on how large it is, it could be very, very oppressive. It could be like being aborted, I suppose. Students, well, you would think then liberals would support that. Students and faculty at the University of Oregon are calling for the removal of the statue of an American pioneer. According to the university, the statue represents, quote, the framing of history from only one culture's perspective, unquote, and it is considering removing the statue along with other art students and staff find offensive. I don't like that painting. Burn it. Burn it now. According to a report by National Palestinian Radio, students and faculty at the University of Oregon are up in arms over a statue of a pioneer on campus. Not any specific pioneer, it's just a guy in a beard and some buckskin clothes and shows him walking west. Although I don't know if the statue's facing west, but it shows him walking, which, in other words, it's an accurate representation of what a lot of pioneers did as they moved across the country. The university has created a task force dedicated to removing offensive pieces of artwork from campus. Isn't art supposed to be provocative? A lot of art, I've been to major galleries. Why is it liberals think it's okay to take a crucifix and put it in a glass full of urine? Well, that's considered art. You can't complain about that. You Christians have no sense of humor, and you're bigots. Or how about a guy that takes a portrait of the Mother of God, as Catholics call her, and if you believe that he is God incarnate, then she was the Mother of God. Her name was Mary. How about liberals who take a portrait of her and they throw poop all over it and then call that art? That's not considered offensive by them. If you're offended, you're told, well, you can't, then don't go see it. But if they're offended because there's a statue of a guy wearing buckskin taking a walk, then it has to come down. Explain that one to me. Any of you liberals listening out there, explain that one, how that works. Why I have to put up with a crucifix in urine, or a woman I consider to be the Mother of God covered in excrement. I guess they'll take the painting to San Francisco. It'll feel right at home. But how is that? I'm supposed to live with that, but you can't live with a statue? I'm sorry, but you snowflakes, if there's going to be a civil war in this country, you better buy your plane tickets and get moving now. One Native American protester, Brett Gilbert, says that the statue is a symbol of the oppression of his people. I guess he's the spokesman now for every last one of them. The pioneer as a symbol is really the championing of the mysticism around Native American history and the myths that people believe that this land was uninhabited and uncivilized, and those things we know aren't true now, Gilbert explained. Maybe they could put up statues for everybody. Well, there wouldn't be any room left on campus, but if everybody got their own statue of what they wanted, yeah, my ancestors were forced to come here after their houses were pulled down in Ireland and Scotland, and so I think that you should have statues to them because they were oppressed people. How about the Poles? Multiple times Poland was wiped from the map, so maybe we could have a Polish statue. And each one of the 500 tribes from across North America could have statues. And then you could have left-handed statues, and you could have gay statues, and everyone could feel better then about themselves. The University of Oregon released a long statement condemning the statue. Those statues, you've got to watch them every minute now. We know what that statue's been up to when nobody's looking. We've had cameras on it. Although it hasn't moved lately, we suspect it's going to do something nefarious, and soon. In the statement, the university argued that the statue fails to convey more than a singular perspective on American history. In particular, according to the statement, the statue ignores the plight of Native Americans who had their lands taken from them. If it showed the guy and he had out his Bowie knife and he was beheading somebody with it who happened to be in a headdress, maybe I could see it, but nothing of the kind is going on. Coming to a state near you. Oh, it already is. Well, then eventually coming to your state. 8:40, we've got a short break. It's 61. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX at newsradio1310.com. I look around Idaho, and there are a number of, well, I think what's really in danger in this state, not necessarily so much statues of heroic people, but, well, what we could be seeing occur. I happen to be in a public park. I think it's a public park in Idaho Falls a couple of years ago. Beautiful setting. And I was standing in the park, and they have, you see, you can get away with having a Ten Commandments monument on your own property or church property. My church has one between the church and the school. And I was in Shoshone County last summer, and they have the Ten Commandments outside the courthouse. My guess is that's because not a lot of liberals are wandering around in Shoshone County who've yet screamed, "This must come to an end, and now you people might be exposed to this and start living a decent lifestyle, and we liberals can't have that." If you lead a decent lifestyle, then you will believe in only same-sex relationships, and you will want to keep your unborn children, and we liberals, we don't approve. But in Idaho Falls, in this public park, they have the Ten Commandments. I've seen it, witnessed it with my own eyes. It's only a matter of time before the liberals will fan out, and then they'll demand that these things have to be taken down. Because you see something like that says, hey, here's a good model to live by, people might have a grand mal seizure. They might stop sinning, or at least they might try to stop sinning. That's probably much more accurate. And it might get them closer to God, and they might actually be able to get to heaven, and we don't want that as liberals. Because liberals want some company where they're going. 843, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. We're at 62. We've got a caller with us. Caller, you're up next. You're on KLIX. Morning, caller. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff, liftoff. We have liftoff. Apparently not. The number to reach the show, 208-736-0300, 208-736-0300. I'm trying to think of any prominent statues even in Twin Falls, and there may be a few, and I can't think of them off the top of my head. There was a city that I used to live in, and they had a big statue of a Civil War general, and it was in a part of town that used to be nice and was no longer nice. But of course, he was a Union general. That probably protected him from the ire of the politically correct, although he still was a fighting man, and that might upset the left and obviously the snowflakes to no end. Caller, you're next. You're on the air on KLIX. Go ahead.
Bill, you have it exactly right. It's what's happening to the name of Teton Redskins in the Teton School District up there. It's nothing more than some very liberal people who just don't think that ought to be appropriate for their kids to put on their resume.
Yeah, in fact, Andre Bilodeau, who was on the show with us a few weeks ago, he fought the case that preserved the copyright on Washington Redskins. He's going to be on the air with us Monday. He's going to be in Cedar City on Monday. I think he's addressing the city council there as well as the school board members. Any who want to listen to him, because they've already removed the name, although that cost some of the board members their jobs. And then he's planning on going to Boise, and he's going to meet with some of our state legislators. I think it's Wednesday next week to talk about defending Teton Redskins.
I think the board will meet up there on the 25th to make that decision. One last comment. I really worry about when somebody gets a hold of a French dictionary and looks up the word Teton. There's going to be a lot of changes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the call. Yeah, the explorers hadn't seen women in a long, long time, obviously. It's 8:46 on News Radio 1310. KLIX at NewsRadio1310.com. Okay, I'm going to try the next line. I think we hit the rollover here. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air on Magic Valley this morning.
Morning, Bill. I was just curious what you think the odds are of Dorothy Moon changing the name of Custer County for him killing indigenous Americans.
I don't know if Dorothy's trying to do that.
Yeah, no, I was just being sarcastic. No, it's a joke. Thanks, Bill.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for the call. Andre, who was on the show with us a couple of weeks ago, he was a part of that lawsuit that maintained the Washington Redskins trademark, which the Obama administration thought it could strip away, and it didn't work. But the politically correct people in Washington, there's an example of how this works. You've got a guy like Juan Williams. He's a lifetime Washington Redskins fan. He refuses to call his favorite team Redskins. He just refers to them as the Washington football team. Phil Simms, the football announcer, does the same thing because it might be mean. Doesn't matter that most indigenous tribesmen like the name. And Andre even told us, and by the way, he's part Indian, that the name originated and was a very respectful name in the beginning, and it's how Indians called themselves to designate themselves as being different from the Caucasians they were encountering. And Andre is also a lifelong Washington Redskins fan. Somewhere I bought when I was a kid, I was in Washington on a school trip when I was 13, and I bought a Washington Redskin license plate. I still have it in a box somewhere at home. And I also bought a Washington Redskins pail, which I would call a politically incorrect urinal, I guess. Anyway, caller joining us on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX at NewsRadio1310.com. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Magic Valley this morning.
Good morning, Bill. Hey, I think I just figured out how we can protect those statues the liberals are trying to get tore down. Next time they start complaining about one of them, we just put up a statue of bin Laden with a copy of the Quran in his hand, surrounded by 60 virgins.
Thank you. Well said. I think that when he actually got to hell, he was standing there saying, "What do you mean? I thought I was going to. Oh, can I have two that are slightly used?" No, it's not going to work that way. Or better yet, I think I have another solution for it. You go out, you know those costumes those women were wearing, the organ costumes? I say organ, not musical organs, but the organ costumes those women were, not Oregon, organ, O-R-G-A-N. Private parts. Nothing to do with any mountain range, by the way, between Idaho and Wyoming. But they were wearing these costumes at these women's marches. Maybe if you clothed the statues in some of those costumes, oh, that's much, much better. Yeah, and I bet that statue doesn't like Donald Trump either. Gee willikers, if we smoke enough dope, maybe he'll actually tell us. 10 minutes away from 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We are just dealing with people, I don't know if there's a better way to put it, that are just plain nuts. And we have to figure out a way to stand up to them, other than just, well, I really love the calls, but how do we say no? Well, they're going to say no over in Victor. As I understand it, when this goes to the school board, and they're being petitioned to remove the Redskins' name, when it goes to the school board, they've opened it up to public comment. So you'll have all of the the women who come in with a really long gray hair and that don't wear makeup, and they'll have their combat boots on and their hemp skirts, and they'll all come in and they'll say, "This is offensive and it needs to be removed." But if somebody shows up who's an actual, maybe from Blackfoot tribe or somewhere else and says, "No, I'm fine with it," they'll say, "Oh, you just don't know any better. We white liberals trust the really smart white queen here. We know better than your kind." Oh, I'm sorry. Does that make me a bigot? Oh, good heavens, I've slipped into their trap. Oh. Well, that's what liberals are. They think that they know better. If you've got 92% of people who call themselves indigenous Americans and they say we're fine with the name, liberals say, "Oh, no, you're totally misguided. We need to set you straight." Well, why don't you just call them dumb Indians then? That's what it sounds like when you say that stuff. But they'll show up and they'll come in and they'll say, "Yeah, we just moved here from California 6 weeks ago and we don't like the name and we think it needs to change. And by the way, you can't get a good latte in town. And, you can't get any good, really authentic Mediterranean food here. When are we going to get all of these things? I love the look of the place, but we've got to change a few things." I had a conversation in 2005. It seems like it was just yesterday. 2005, I went to my 25th high school reunion. And what we do is we have a class reunion on Friday nights. And then what they do is they have an alumni dinner on Saturdays. And there were people, there was one of my kindergarten teacher was there. I was in the buffet line and there was an old woman in front of me. She was class of 1938. And she turned around, looked at me and said, "Oh, hello, Billy. How are you?" She taught for about 50 years, thousands of students, and she turns around. There I am standing there as I was by that time in my early 40s, and she picks me up right in the crowd like that. "Hey, how you doing?" But I went there, and I was talking at the alumni dinner to a man after the dinner portion ended and everyone mingles. And he was telling me how disgusted he was because newcomers come into these small communities and they think everything has to change. And they're generally liberals. They come in and they see a few old Victorian houses and some beautiful old Victorian or beautiful old brick buildings in the downtown. In my hometown when I was a kid, actually, the streets were brick. That got to be very expensive. So in many cases, they just poured asphalt right over the top of the bricks. It was easier to maintain. Snowplows, when they're coming down the street and they hit bricks, the bricks just pop up all over the place. But you have this very quaint-looking community, and the liberals come in from outside, and the housing prices are cheap, and they say, "Hey, we can open up a macrame shop here and make a living doing that, and maybe fire a little pottery, and we can come here, and it's so beautiful." And then they get there, and they find out, well, it's a dairy farming community mainly, and people work for a living, and people have very conservative viewpoints, and there's a clash that goes on. And then they show up at City Hall. These are the same nitwits who show up and say, "That dairy farm stinks. It needs to move." I came here and I bought a house and I didn't expect that. Well, what happened when you passed by the, 120 head of cattle in the field? Did you think that they were just cutouts? So they come into a community and they say it must change for what they want. Well, I was talking to this guy, and I had just written a letter. The newspaper, local town newspaper, had been taken over by some out-of-town liberals, and I had written them a guest commentary where I really ripped them. I won't say what I ripped them, but doing number 2 is a little easier for them now than it used to be. So I really ripped them, and they published it. And he said to me, good for you. And I told him, and he agreed with me. I said, they show up. They like the look of the place because they think they're going to see Andy and Barney on the street. And won't that be fun? And maybe there'll be a quilting contest too that we can go to. And Barney will ride around in the old motorcycle around town until Andy tells him that it's a relic and they've got to put it in the museum. Well, won't that be just great? And when they discover that it is not Mayberry, then they grow infuriated. And they think that, as social engineers as we liberals all are, we're going to change it into Mayberry. And then the locals say, hey, why don't you take a hike? Why don't you go back to California or New York City or Boston or wherever the heck it is you came from and go back and commune with all of your disease-minded people? This is what's going on in Teton right now. And you're going to have these people show up at that school board meeting and they're going to come in and say, this isn't nice. And this is going to hurt somebody's feelings. And we're deeply offended. And I know you've done it 100 years this way here, but you need to stop it and stop it right now. And then they're going to get their ears pinned back because there's going to be some old lean rancher, muscled lean rancher about 6'6", and he's going to stand up in the middle of all of this and say, well, I'm 5th generation here. My family survived, and we survived horrible winters. And snow 6 feet deep, and we survived all the other elements in dealing with predators, and we're still here to this day. And I played football for the Redskins way back in 1974, and I'm going to tell you people right now, don't mess with us. And then the liberals are going to say, he's being mean-spirited, and we feel threatened, and he needs to be removed from the meeting because we feel threatened by his actions. But you know what? There are going to be a lot more of him than there are going to be these liberals. And these liberals are the wannabes. They couldn't afford a house in Jackson, so they bought a house on the other side of the mountain range. And now they think that it should become Jackson. And that I'm still surprised they haven't demanded that they take down all of the antlers in Jackson. How many of us have actually stood there and taken selfies of, I've done it, stood there by the park and click, 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 so I could send them to friends all around the country. How long before people say, well, that's cruel and inhumane. It symbolizes the killing of animals. And we should all just be eating lentil beans. And if we all ate lentil beans, we could power the world with our flatulence. And it would no longer come out of just my mouth. And if Bill would tear me another one, it would vent much more easily. All right, I got to get to a break in just a minute, but I do want to point out we have one more hour of Magic Valley this morning still ahead on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And that is a reminder for the time being. And we even have them in Twin Falls. They're the only ones who can get their letters any longer printed in the local newspapers. And they just had a pagan festival this past weekend. We have them coming to Twin Falls, but overwhelmingly, their numbers are still small. They will back down if you confront them. I've seen these liberals at meetings, and you find out, when I mentioned earlier, it's like not poking a bear in the eye. It's like poking a field mouse in the eye. They will back down when they realize that they are of course, then they'll just go and they'll hang out in a closet with the rest of their kind and talk about how everyone's being mean to them. And so they'll get on the telephone back to California and say, yeah, you need to come out here and join us. News is next on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. It's 63. Coming up on 8:59, Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning. Steve Millington had a comment when he was here yesterday. He was sharing some details from a column written by Cal Thomas. I usually read Thomas's column either in the Washington Times or at Jewish World Review, which is, oddly enough, despite the name sounding like it's mainly a religious publication, It's actually a conservative publication. And you get some fine writers there. This is an online publication. You get some fine writers there. Cal Thomas is among them. Steve mentioned Thomas talking about the massive national debt this country has and where that could take us. All of our economic growth could always end up being scuttled because of some of the issues that will arise there with the cost of all that debt and paying it down at some point, if indeed anybody ever has the courage to take a stab at it. Steve mentioned as well that the F-35, Thomas was writing about the cost of the F-35, which is the next generation U.S. fighter jet, and it's expected it could give us the advantage over any opponent for the next couple of generations. But the jet is very expensive, and Bernie Sanders would just simply scrap the whole project in order that he can give you everything else for free. The same free, and I want to repeat this, the same free he said that would be paid for by taxes, which he said the American people would be delighted to pay. That's his words, not mine, that you would be delighted to pay taxes. Well, let's do a poll on that and see how people feel. 8 minutes after 9 o'clock on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning at 62. A writer named Lauren Thompson, writing at Forbes. Trump drives down price of F-35 fighter 25% from Obama level. And Obama was no great friend of the military. If I used to read this correctly, when I had a friend, he was serving in the Army, and he would send me the polls from the Military Times. Military is still overwhelmingly Republican. It infuriates media when they see someone like a George W. Bush or a Donald Trump go visit a military base, and they're treated, just with hoots and hollers. And Barack Obama would go to these places, and the troops would sit on their hands. I did tell the story. That happened one time. I think it was at Fort Bragg. And the president at the time, Mr. Obama, went there to speak, and there was barely any applause. And Don Lemon at CNN was upset by it, thinking that the troops who put themselves in harm's way, unlike a cushy CNN anchor job, would not sit there and give Mr. Obama rapturous applause because, as Lemon knew, Obama was God. After that, military was instructed to tell the troops, you've got to have some polite response for the president. So I guess they had a big applause sign that would go on and off when it was time to cheer Mr. Obama. A writer by the name of Lauren Thompson says, media coverage of President Trump is so consistently negative that a casual observer might easily conclude that he has accomplished nothing constructive during his time in the White House. But here is an example of a major spending program where the president pledged to save billions of dollars and proceeded to do precisely that through tough negotiating and relentless pressure. The program in question is the F-35 fighter, by far the biggest weapons program currently being funded anywhere in the world. The Pentagon has developed 3 different versions of the F-35 to replace the Cold War tactical aircraft of the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. Each one of these services has slightly different needs. The plane is also being bought by a dozen allies. Trump began his campaign to lower the cost of F-35 even before he was inaugurated. In a tweet he wrote on December 12, 2016, President-elect said billions of dollars can and will be saved by pressing contractors for a better deal. In this case, it was Lockheed Martin. There's a photograph of the plane here, too, it's a spectacular-looking plane. I just have heard, depending on who you listen to, some people are criticizing it, saying it's not going to do what we expect it to do, and it's got lots of problems and other issues. But these early generations of anything you build like that always have those issues, and then you work on it, you get better and better and better. Trump was convinced, the writer says, he could do better than the Obama White House had done because he thought he was a better negotiator. After all, Obama would just bow and say, I'm sorry, my country's done all the bad things. We won't do them again. Here's a lot of money. Go build yourself a nuclear program. It turns out, the writer says, Donald Trump was right. In the first production lot that his team negotiated, Lot 10, the price tag for the Air Force version fell by 8%. Now, that was only to $94 million a copy, but by 8%. The cost of other variants of the Navy and Marine Corps fell too, saving taxpayers overall $500 million just on that one production lot. The President's critics will try to explain away these savings by claiming that increasing production delivered economies of scale. But nobody at Lockheed Martin had been anticipating the price would go down so fast. In fact, this writer says he's in a think tank with some of the executives at Lockheed Martin, and they do say that the president drove a hard bargain. And in fact, the price continues to drop on each copy of the plane, each lot that is being produced. And so he says, we now have a new handshake agreement disclosed last week that will carry the price tag for the F-35 below $80 million when Lot 13 is reached. That's less than the price of the new F-16. So he's gone from $102 billion a copy down to, I say $102 million, I believe that the figure happens to be. But he's looking at this and he's pointing out, he says, so we dropped the cost down from $102 million under Obama to it'll be about $78 million now under President Trump. And mainstream media doesn't talk about these things because they keep claiming, well, he brags about being a negotiator in his books, but we all know he's a big liar and he's covering up his real issues. Yeah. You know, developers, they're really big developers. Bankruptcy's always right around the corner. You're rolling the dice. I had a piece I read on the air a couple of weeks ago for many of you. You might recall it. And the writer said if it wasn't for developers, America wouldn't have any big gleaming cities today, which is how we got where we are because people in America used to take risks. A lot of people. Now it's basically a handful of developers who are doing it, and they're out there on a limb sometimes. And even if they fail, the ones who succeed transform our economy and our culture. We used to call that progress. Liberals don't believe that anything is progress anymore. Even though they call themselves progressives, they're trying to go backwards. Speaking of the debt, a writer named Justin Bogey, writing at the Daily Signal, our economy is strong, but also is the possibility that it may have an Achilles heel, the national debt. That was the consensus of participants in a recent panel discussion at the Heritage Foundation. It's a bipartisan issue, he goes on to say, the panel pointed out. Americans agree in overwhelming numbers, as in 94% of Republicans and 92% of Democrats, according to recent polling by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, that future generations will be better off if the national debt is managed. I guess they say it's not going to go away, but if it's managed, how do you manage it? We are talking reductions, aren't we? Isn't that the whole goal? We're not seeing it yet. The writer says Mark Goldwein, Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, said at the event the national debt crowds out investment as investors purchase government bonds rather than buying private assets or otherwise investing in the private sector. Over time, he argued, that could result in slower wage growth, slower income growth, and a slower overall economy. Now, 2 points I want to make on this as I'm reading this. Number one is this is already starting to show up. Most business growth in the United States starts at the small business level. Apple started in a garage. Microsoft started in a garage. So business growth, Henry Ford started in a garage. Business growth generally starts that way with entrepreneurs who then build bigger and bigger things. If you go back and you look at the World of Tomorrow from, I think it was the World's Fair in 1964, many of the companies that sponsored that exhibit are no longer around. But new companies move up and take their place. The problem is we're not getting the small business investment. Ever since the economy tanked in 2008, 2009, we're not getting the small business investment that we used to get. Why? Well, first of all, there was the big stimulus package. And if people are buying government bonds, then they're not putting money into small business growth. And as long as this debt stays high, that's not going to go away. And the debt has continued to grow under President Trump. Is it President Trump's fault? Well, he doesn't have a line item veto. We've already been told that line item veto is unconstitutional. Heck, even a Democrat like Bill Clinton wanted that. It was one of the few issues he joined conservatives on. He wanted that because he thought, I can eliminate pork barrel projects and save the taxpayers money. There was a story, and it was reported by Pravda on the Potomac last week, that Mick Mulvaney, who was White House budget director, then he got appointed, he is now White House acting chief of staff, and the new budget director, that they have been going over to Capitol Hill trying to pressure They're not getting far with Democrats who want to spend. It's going to be free. But they can't get any action out of people like Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy, the two Republican leaders. McConnell, the majority leader over in the Senate, and McCarthy, the minority leader over in the House of Representatives. They are refusing now to actually negotiate or deal with Mulvaney and the budget director. And McConnell saying, well, I'm only going to negotiate and do talks with the president. Well, why don't you talk to the real money guys? Well, because if I talk to the real money guys and we actually came to an agreement, we'd have to cut spending, and some of my members who thought this would be a lifetime career wouldn't be able to hold their jobs. Because life's pretty cushy here over at the U.S. Senate. So what are we going to do about the debt? I know that this system of government, Winston Churchill talked about not only the parliamentary system, but ours, Churchill's mother being an American. And he always felt that he was, very much an American as well. But Churchill said that, we had the best, well, if not the best form of government, all the rest were worse. And so I think there's some truth to that. However, I read a piece a couple of weeks ago where the writer said the founding principles of our founding fathers started to unravel shortly after the founding of the country. And there's a lot of truth to that, because they believed that people would be, that was part of the Enlightenment crusade, that people would be on their best behavior, that men called to their better natures would do the right thing. But Franklin and some of the others weren't quite so gracious. And there's that old line about Franklin saying when people realized they could vote themselves a raise from the Treasury, they would start doing that. And once Franklin Roosevelt came along and launched what he called the New Deal, followed by Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and we had all of these programs that Bernie Sanders would describe as got to be free. We've developed an addiction to all of these programs, and there may not be any other way around it. And here's a sad prediction. The day will come where the only way to tame this is a strong man takes over the country, which is just a phrase they use to describe someone who takes total control, bypasses Congress and just says, sorry, you're not getting your checks anymore. Because we do have to still build tanks and F-35s and battle cruisers and aircraft carriers, and we can't do that if we continue down this path. And it's going to be a very, very difficult day in this country when that comes around. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on News Radio. Think about when you're pushing your child through the aisle at the grocery store and the child's in the cart and can't reach all the candy. And how sometimes the kid pitches a fit. Imagine that writ large when people stop getting their checks from the government. A member of our listening audience shares that he was in the audience at Fort Bragg the day that Obama spoke. Oh, this was about 2010 or so, or 2011, and there was very little applause from the troops. And the writer tells me, he said they were basically strong-armed into going. He said nobody wanted to go. It just galls media that real people in this country, people who do most of the heavy lifting in this country, will not get on board with their worship of their fellow traveling liberals. I didn't get a thrill up the leg. 9:22, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 65. I've got a caller with us, and caller, you're up next. You're on the air on KLIX.
Hi, Bill. Bill, I think I've got a good money saver. Years ago, there used to be the CC group that cleaned up. Maybe somebody in the cities can get groups together with wheelbarrows and shovels and rakes, and maybe somebody with a pest control, and clean up certain areas, and then at a certain time have them a coffee break, a little donut. At the end of the shift, give them some food stamps.
Well, I don't think you're far off the mark. I thank you for the call. I was reading the other day that the difference between Franklin Roosevelt and the current liberals is Roosevelt expected you were going to do some work for that check. Steve Millington, his family's a fine example. During the Depression, a lot of people needed work. His dad was a young guy, and his dad got a job with the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it wasn't, you didn't get rich doing it, but the money, you could send it home to your family. You couldn't. You didn't have many opportunities to spend it. You were living out in the middle of a camp somewhere, in the middle of the forest. So his father's role was to put out fires. His dad even explained that sometimes a fire will just almost explode up a tree, and a fireball then comes out the top of the tree, and you don't want to be under it. But those men went out there, and they were fighting fires with shovels. No modern equipment. But Roosevelt put people to work building dams and these things. But you had to work in order to earn your keep and to get your lunch. It wasn't free. And this has somehow evolved over the course of the last 80 years into being, well, we wouldn't want to embarrass them by telling them they had to get a job. When I was a boy, there were kids who got free lunches. And I'm sure if you were getting a free lunch, and I don't think a lot of people in elementary school knew the difference, but as they got older, I'm sure they were teased about getting free lunches. And it wasn't their fault that mom and dad were poor, but they got teased about it. And so the school eventually, no matter whether you were getting a free lunch or you paid for your lunch, everybody got the same punch card. So nobody's feelings would be hurt by that. And then someone said, well, even that system is kind of difficult to maneuver. So why don't we the school will tax everybody and everyone will get their lunch paid for. That way, nobody goes hungry. But still, there are people out there who don't meet the criteria for a free lunch. They got to pay the taxes to feed their kid the free lunch. So that is not a solution necessarily. But we've moved from this notion that trying to tell people they have to work for an EBT card. I think Maine is one of the few states. They had a governor there who, he was an independent, but he angered the public. Paul, and I'm trying to remember his last name now. I have a friend who grew up there, and he told me stories about this guy. He really liked him. But the guy insisted, and they put in place a plan. And it was workfare instead of welfare. It did two things. It gave people who were actually working a sense of self-worth. It also reduced the roles greatly because a lot of people said, well, if I'm going to be working, I'm going to go find another job that I like better. And when they did that, they got off the EBT card. Simple, isn't it? But we don't look at it that way because liberals have told us, again, it's mean-spirited to take that approach. So better to let people just stay home. I forgot the candidate. One of these, it might have been AOC. One of these politicians said all that long ago that, if people don't want to work, we shouldn't force them to do it. If they're happy or just sitting around scratching themselves watching TV that you paid for, let them do it. All right. Maybe we could send them to a camp, a concentration camp, and they could all do it there. No, we can't do that. That would be mean, too. I've got another caller joining us. Caller, you're next. You're on the air on KLIX at 926.
I'll tell you what, Bill, we need another thing we need to get rid of to help these people get off the welfare roll is get rid of that earned income credit and let them go pick trash along the sides of the road. Give them a part-time job. Make them worth a little bit.
That earned income credit is a massive amount of money.
Oh, yeah. And who picks it up? You and I.
Yeah. In fact, I was shocked when I first heard this from a tax preparer. I used to go to a preparer when I was a younger guy because the preparer told me, he said, look, if you're doing your taxes on your own, he said, I still might be able to save you some money. But he was explaining what that was. I mean, it is worth thousands of dollars to some of these people.
Oh, yeah, there's some people here in our county that get quite a bit of money. Well, you have a good day, Bill.
Hey, thank you. Money, of course, we could all spend on our own bills. But you can't do that. Then they say, well, people can't afford retirement. Well, yeah, because I've been paying for everybody else. No wonder people can't afford retirement any longer. They can't put any money away. Coming up on 927, a guy by the name of John Marini is with the Claremont Institute. He was appearing on FNC, that's Fox News Channel, with Mark Levin. And he says, we have a need to eliminate the administrative state, which is partly responsible for all of this.
There's absolutely no authority for the administrative realm in the Constitution. Every authority that is in the Constitution is a political authority. So it derives either from the legislative, executive, or judicial powers. Now, every government has to have an administration, obviously. But the administration that we have now, and the reason why it's sometimes called rational administration, is not merely carrying out the political will. It's establishing its own authority to carry out, to deal with problems that those who have political authority are no longer dealing with. They've, in a certain way, turned those decisions over to those who have specialized knowledge.
Given the university mindset, given the self-perpetuation, if you will, of the bureaucracy, I mean, first and foremost, it needs to survive,
Right.
thrive, expand, devour, if you will.
Right.
It benefits mostly which ideology versus another and which party versus another?
Oh, there's no question that this is all part of the progressive legacy. The progressive legacy was to establish, really, a modern administrative or rational state. And that meant, of course, then that the problems of society would be solved by expert knowledge, not social institutions. It's meant really to replace civil society, these structures. And in a certain way, that extends all the way down almost to the family.
In their discussion, I was listening to this the other day, in their discussion, they were also pointing out that the administrative state is essentially an offshoot of college professors, the academic elite in this country. But that warning at the end when he said this was designed to replace civil society. Yeah, there was a time when neighbors looked out for neighbors and churches looked out for people in town, and the administrative state has wiped all of that away. Their goal being that you rely on them exclusively. 9:30, because of course they know better. 64 right now. Mark, who's coming up next? Oh, yeah, that guy. Well, anyway, we've got another half hour of the program. Todd from Todd Starnes, but I just noticed Todd Eccles is in the building. I could not get his attention. If I could have, I would have had him step into the studio for a couple of minutes, just unplanned, so I could ask him about his thoughts on Eric Swalwell having a news conference yesterday. There were more reporters there than there were people attending his event. He had a news conference outside NRA headquarters in Washington yesterday. Swalwell is one of the 698 Democrats running for the president's job, and he decided he was going to have a gun confiscation rally outside the NRA offices. What if you hold a rally and nobody shows up? So a couple of reporters showed up. He's not a leading candidate, so he doesn't get the attention that the others happen to get. And he's out there talking, and he's got like I said, most of these people are his relatives, apparently, or his own staff from over at the House of Representatives. Like 10 people there. That's it. It's a little bit like the anti-Trump rallies that took place. Some of you may have heard about those. That they were Trump impeachment rallies that were scheduled across the country. And the liberals said, oh boy, we're going to show everybody just how much interest there is in this. And again, there's a guy sitting at a desk with a pamphlet and a sign that says take one. And he's waiting for somebody to come by, and a very lonely day for some of those people. Still, in some parts of the country, if you've got a big enough city, you can still get enough malcontents to come out. There's also a group of people, we used to say, that have cause, they'll show up. I remember many, many years ago, being a young reporter, I was working in Syracuse, New York. And whenever there'd be a demonstration, there'd be the same core people, the same dozen people who would show up. Anti-war demonstration, you got it. Demonstration condemning white people for the treatment of indigenous tribes, got it. The same people show up. Demonstration against Columbus Day, same people show up. Demonstration against the local baseball team for having a logo that was offensive, boom, same people show up. And, one of my coworkers one day said, do those people actually have jobs? Well, this will happen if you have a Trump impeachment rally in many places around the country. Lawrence Jones, who is a young conservative, but he happens to be a black man, which, you see, it's okay to make fun of black people if they're conservatives. If they're liberals, of course, it would be racist. Jones was sent to one of the rallies in New York City by Fox News. He appeared on Sean Hannity's program on the Fox News channel, and they had a discussion about what then transpired.
There were some moments. Vile, racist, vicious, horrible. Two men actually approached our own Lawrence Jones, and one told him to go back to Fox News where there's, quote, more cotton for you to pick. We don't have that on tape, but we do have the next comment on tape. Take a look.
And obviously the people before us that accomplished all this. I'll tell you to go back to Kenya next.
Here now is Fox News contributor, editor-in-chief, Campus Reform, Lawrence Jones. We talked Saturday. I was pretty pissed off. Yeah. You probably heard me in a way I don't usually go on the air, true or false, but I'm upset that happened. Tell everybody what happened. I thought these were supposed to be the accepting, loving, wonderful, tolerant people of the left. Apparently not.
Yeah, this is who they are, Sean. You know, so often those of us that are on the right are painted as the racist people, the hateful people. I mean, you discuss this all the time on your program. And I was just asking these people simple questions about if they felt like the president should be impeached or not. These guys come up to me and they say, you know, go back to Fox News to pick cotton. They say go back to Kenya. This is who these people are, but I doubt many people in the media are going to condemn these people.
No, they're not. People get abused by a bunch of white guys in Charlottesville. That's different. A black man gets abused by a bunch of liberals in New York. Oh, he deserved it because, he's got a Fox logo there, so he deserves everything he gets. Back when he was in Congress, and it wasn't for a very long period of time, which is unfortunate. I think the greatest living American is Lieutenant Colonel Allen West. Allen West decided he was going to join the Congressional Black Caucus. They didn't want him. So West told them, he said, well, obviously I look like you, so I would fit the definition of black. Number two, I am a member of Congress. Therefore, I think that I should be a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. They admitted him, but they tried to do everything they could to exclude him from meetings. In other words, he didn't get schedules. Things like that would crop up. Why? Because he ain't a liberal. 940 on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. We're at 64. Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning. Some closing thoughts on the way in just a few minutes. I was just thinking, we talked earlier about Bernie Sanders and everything is going to be free. We're not going to see a lot of these candidates in Idaho. We just don't have the electoral clout when it comes to electoral votes. And during the primary, a lot of them, too, are going to be looking at regional differences. So you'll have a handful of Democrats who come through Idaho, but a lot of them will just simply bypass it, looking for bigger delegate hauls. Still, I would think that some of these people would be more than willing to come on the program if we really twisted their arms. And I was thinking about calling Bernie's campaign to see if he could become available. All I got was the answering machine. Although the music is interesting. Judas Priest, how long do you have to wait for the beep? 9:43, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX and newsradio1310.com. How far we have come to the notion of everything's going to be free from the days of individual liberty. Now, I'm old enough to remember this man. This is from a legendary speech that he made 55 years ago. He didn't win the presidency, but he laid the groundwork for what was to come later with Ronald Reagan, who was a close political ally.
Let our republicanism, so focused and so dedicated, not be made fuzzy and futile by unthinking and stupid labels. I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
Now, he was despised by the elites, the party establishment, running as very cold water, if you didn't know. He was despised by the GOP establishment. They wanted nothing to do with him. But he managed to capture the heart and soul of the regular people in the party. His difficulty was Americans had not yet realized just how out of control this giant deep state was getting. Number two, he was running against the memory of an assassinated president, and he went down to defeat. The thing is, if you were to resurrect Barry Goldwater today, the Republican establishment still wouldn't like him. For many of the same reasons they don't like Donald Trump, although they've looked at Trump's poll numbers and they'll tell you, oh, Donald Trump's doing a fine job. Behind the scenes, they don't talk much about Donald Trump in polite conversation. The conversation is anything but polite when they talk about him. I get exposed to a little bit of this off the air. I know a little bit about what I'm talking about, and I still have a lot of friends in politics throughout the country and get a lot of feedback from them. They're just not willing, being that there's a shortage of political courage that inflicts every political party. They're not willing to always come out and say these things. 946, we're at 65 on News Radio 1310 KLIX at newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you on Magic Valley this morning up until 10 a.m. And then, of course, the Rush Limbaugh program will follow the news. Got a couple of things, too, mentioning polling data. This comes from a writer, but I think his name is James Freeman. He writes at the Wall Street Journal. His column is called The Best of the Web. Now, several different people have authored this column over a number of years. He's the latest. NBC WSJ, that means Wall Street Journal poll, suggests Trump is not especially partisan. That's the other part of this. Those people in that crowd in Florida that were there to see him yesterday, these are not your traditional old William Crystal type of conservatives. They're not your George Will type of conservatives. The people who tell you that if you just go along with them, everything will be better, especially very good for them. But they really wouldn't want to be seen eating dinner with you. A lot of the people who showed up for the Trump rally last night are the traditional, they're the street-level Republicans. They're Main Street Republicans. They're people who are in local business. And many of them are independents, and some are even Democrats who've been fed up with the wacky course of their party over the last dozen years. Mr. Freeman writes, he says, not that voters don't give Mr. Trump a large share of the blame when asked who is responsible for the partisanship that goes on in Washington. In the June poll, 43% of respondents give the Trump White House almost all or a major part of the blame. Now, that number does sound big. When you consider that another 23% give Team Trump at least half the blame, it doesn't seem to leave all that much room for other politicians. It's instructive to evaluate him in comparison to other presidents. Polling doesn't tell you a lot of that. You realize even in early 2012, it looked as if Mitt Romney was going to defeat Barack Obama. And a week before Election Day 2016, Hillary Clinton was a cinch. A comment made this morning, the pollster Nate Silver from 538 blog, he gets a lot of credit for being the sage pollster who knows exactly what the numbers are going to be. And the Monday before Election Day in 2016, he said Clinton's chance of a victory were 99%. He also said the Boston Bruins were going to win the Stanley Cup in Game 7 last week. He's been very, very astute, I'm telling you. The writer goes on to say, on that score, the Journal and NBC note that at the start of the Obama presidency, a full 56% of survey participants blamed the White House of President George W. Bush for almost all or a major part of Beltway partisanship, and another 25% gave Team Bush at least half the blame. So the numbers were higher for Bush. Mr. Bush, the writer says, was blamed by much of the press corps for some of his own failings, as well as the failings of others. After observing the media habit of assigning culpability to America's 43rd president, even for problems he could not possibly have caused, this column's most celebrated alumnus started a running feature entitled, We Blame George W. Bush. He's referring to a writer who's named James Taranto. James Taranto has since been kicked upstairs. He's working as one of the main editors now at the Wall Street Journal. also happens to be a close friend of our Twin Falls County Prosecuting Attorney Grant Loeb's. I was sitting here one day and we were talking about Taranto on the air, and we went to a commercial break, and the prosecuting attorney got a tweet of all things from the very same guy we had just been talking about, who, by the way, hadn't been listening, although he should have been. The writer, Mr. Freeman, writing the current column, says, recent history shows there's nothing unique about a presidency marked by bitter partisan opposition. It has happened before. Andrew Jackson, who seems to be especially a hero of President Trump, let's just put it this way. Jackson was reviled by the elites. He was reviled by the media. He split a lot of people in his own party. He was detested by the other party. It was not a quiet 8 years of the Jackson administration by any means. Still, and liberals today say he's a genocidal maniac. Jackson was certainly a very angry and flawed man, but the country was better. If you think about the country that we have today, it was better after his administration left because of some of the groundwork that he had put in place. Some people say, well, it wasn't better for those who were on the Trail of Tears. Certainly not. But the country that grew out of what was the founding and then those builders in the middle is the same country that won World War I and World War II. Liberals just can't explain that away, no matter how hard they try. That country that in World War II especially, that line, arsenal of democracy, that was coined by Franklin Roosevelt was certainly true. In fact, Detroit Arsenal, which was a tank plant owned by Chrysler, produced more tanks in just that one factory over 3.5 years. You got to remember that factory got commissioned right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It wasn't actually built and ready to really roll out a lot of tanks until 1943. That one factory built more tanks than the Germans did during the entirety of the Germans fighting World War II. And their fight was about twice as long as our fight in the number of years. So every factory building tanks in Germany was outbuilt by just one factory in this country, and we had other factories building tanks. And if you think about what Boeing cranked out, and the number of Jeeps that were cranked out, and the number of Deuces and a halfs that were cranked out, and the United States was sending these to the Soviet Union and to England and to Canada, and so all of the war materials that were almost exclusively used, the Russians had pretty good tanks they were building themselves with a lot of slave labor. But the Russian offensive against the Germans, and yes, they did the most to crush the German war machine, but they were doing it in our Deuce and a half trucks and with a lot of our firearms and a lot of our ammunition that we were cranking out. They wouldn't have been able to do that anywhere near as quickly, and maybe not at all, if it hadn't been for that Lend-Lease assistance. And just, the Murmansk run that was taking in shiploads of all of these materials and supplies and just dropping them off. Stalin would never acknowledge that, we should point out. I would doubt today even the Russians acknowledge that. It's likely not in any of their history books. But all of this was going on simply because the United States did this. If the United States had not been a player, because the United States would not have been a player, for instance, if men like Jackson didn't exist, or men like Lincoln didn't exist, or men like Theodore Roosevelt, for all of his warts, if he had existed, there would have been nothing that would have come out of all of these places, because the United States would have been a minor player on the world stage. With that, it's very possible that the Axis powers, well, if not one, could have prolonged a stalemate that lasted decades and plunged the world into darkness. This is the thing that modern American liberals refuse to acknowledge. They have all of their gender studies programs on campus, and they have all of their programs complaining about the patriarchy, and that includes American presidents. They have their programs that complain about how America has been so mean around the world, and with its rubber plants and sending troops in to support United Fruit down in Central America. But throughout all of this, as it turns out, American influence has been much better on the planet than any of them would like to give it credit for. And over the last 200 years, is there another nation that can claim to be as influential for the good of the planet than the United States? And yet, we're not only blamed by other countries for all of their woes, Iran likes to point the finger at the great Satan. You've got third world countries still in Africa and in Asia that point their fingers at us and say, well, the United States is keeping us down. But seriously, the United States would like new markets, so the United States would like to see them come up. But they don't want to tell their people that because, well, if you're a kleptocrat running the country and you've been robbing it blind, making the needed reforms to actually become a trading nation, you don't want to do that. And if you do that, you can't take what you've been taking. And if your people find out what you've been taking, they're going to come hang you. So better to blame the United States. That's been going on for decades. Been going on for decades. What's the difference is that over the last 50 years, that thinking process has seeped into our major institutions. Academia, Hollywood, the music industry. And they've been telling everybody that America is bad and needs to be a repentant nation. They laugh when Christians talk about repentance, but they say we need to repent for our secular sins and the sins of the white man or just men in general. And they spread this hoo-ha all over the land. And it is seeped into corporate America, of all places. 30 years ago when I was on a college campus, well, 35, when I was on a college campus, corporate America was the devil, according to all the liberal professors and the liberal students on campus. It was the devil. And now corporate America, it truly is, because it's trying to bully Louisiana and Georgia and Alabama and states that are standing up for the right thing. And how much longer this is going to continue, I mentioned this fellow Robert Kaplan writing a piece at National Interest, which I sat down and read after the show yesterday morning. And it's fascinating how he points out that you can start to tell the decline of a civilization, of a culture, when the elites inside that own culture and civilization begin to despise it. These are the people who are in control. And I'm going to get back to an overarching theme this morning because he launched his re-election campaign last night. The President of the United States is just about the only person saying this has to come to an end. Ronald Reagan told the American people that our best days were not behind us, even though all of these elites were trying to push us into that camp. Donald Trump is really the first person who's come along since Reagan left a little over 30 years ago to very much say the same thing. Some of his beliefs might be not in a match with Reagan, a very good match. Some of his approaches might not be much of a match, but he's saying the same thing. 9:58. We've got to wrap it up for the day. God willing, if the creek don't rise, I'm back in this seat tomorrow morning between 6 and 10 a.m. The Rush Limbaugh program is on the way following the news at 10 o'clock.